In 1989, a film crew set up cameras in front of a rose-colored building carved into a cliff in the middle of the Jordanian desert. The scene they were shooting became one of the most famous moments in movie history, a place where, according to the story, the Holy Grail itself had been hidden for 2,000 years, sealed inside a chamber beneath ancient stone. It was fiction, obviously, a myth built for a summer blockbuster. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Nobody who worked on that film thought they were filming anything real. They picked this location because it looked mysterious enough to hold a legend. 35 years later, archaeologists dug into the ground beneath that exact building, not looking for a grail, not chasing a movie plot, following radar readings that suggested something was down there. What they found was a sealed tomb that had never been touched. 12 complete skeletons, undisturbed since the day they were buried, and in the hand of one of them, still resting exactly where it had been placed 2,000 years ago. A ceramic vessel that looked unmistakably like a chalice. Nobody planned this. Nobody could have. A piece of fiction, invented for a movie in 1989, turned out to be standing almost directly on top of something real. So what's actually buried beneath Petra's most famous monument? And why did it take archaeologists 200 years of studying this place to finally find it? To understand why that chalice matters, you have to understand what it took just to find the front door of this place again. Because for close to 500 years, the outside world had no idea Petra still existed at all. The city sits in what's now southern Jordan, carved into a valley of sandstone cliffs that shift color depending on the hour. Pale gold at midday, deep rose by late afternoon, almost bruised purple right before dark. That color is the reason people call it the Rose City, and it's not an exaggeration dreamed up by a tourism board. The iron oxide running through the stone genuinely does that, layer by layer, the way rings do inside a tree. The people who built it were the Nabateans, and here's the part most casual retellings skip past entirely. Nobody is fully certain where they came from. They show up in the historical record as nomadic traders moving through the Arabian desert, and within a few centuries, they transformed into something else. A settled kingdom controlling the trade routes that carried frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silk between Arabia, the Mediterranean, and everywhere in between. That control made them extraordinarily wealthy, and wealth on that scale in that era tends to get carved into stone. Petra became the physical expression of that wealth. Not a single monument, but an entire city, its temples, tombs, theaters, and dwellings cut directly into the surrounding rock face, rather than built up from the ground the way most ancient cities were. And the single most photographed structure among all of it, the one that draws close to 1 million visitors a year, the one that ended up on movie screens in 1989, is Al-Khazna, the Treasury. You reach it by walking through the Saik, a narrow gorge barely wide enough in places for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder, stretching for nearly a kilometer between sheer rock walls that rise more than 100 feet on either side. It's not an accident of geography that visitors approach this way. The Nabateans built processional routes, water channels, and carved niches for their gods along this exact corridor, which means every person who's ever walked toward the Treasury, 2,000 years ago or this morning, has moved through a space engineered to build anticipation before the reveal. And then the canyon opens, and the facade appears all at once, nearly 40 meters tall, framed by columns and pediments, carved with a precision that still makes first-time visitors stop walking entirely. It looks from certain angles almost Greek, which makes sense because the Nabateans borrowed architectural vocabulary from everywhere their trade routes touched, blending it into something that doesn't cleanly belong to any single tradition. Here's the detail that should catch your attention though, because it's been sitting in plain sight for 2 centuries. Despite the name, a name given by local legend, not by anyone who actually built the thing, nobody has ever found treasure inside the Treasury. The name comes from a large stone urn carved into the upper facade, which local tradition once claimed was stuffed with gold. For generations, people took that legend seriously enough to shoot at the urn with rifles, hoping to crack it open. You can still see the marks today, scattered across the stone like small wounds. There was never anything inside. It's solid rock, carved for decoration, not storage. Which raises the more interesting question archaeologists have actually spent 2 centuries chasing. If it was never a treasury, what was it actually built for? The leading theory has always been that it served as a royal tomb, likely for a Nabatean king, possibly Aretas IV, who ruled during the kingdom's wealthiest period. But that theory ran into an awkward problem for a very long time. If the treasury was built as a tomb, where was the body? Where were any bodies? For roughly 200 years of modern excavation, nobody had found a single human remain inside or beneath the structure that could confirm what everyone assumed was true. That gap between what the architecture strongly implied and what the physical evidence actually proved is exactly the kind of unresolved question that tends to sit quietly in academic papers for generations. Mentioned in passing, never fully answered, until somebody finally has the right tool and the right permission to look properly. In this case, it would take radar pulses fired into the ground, a research team with decades of patience and a piece of luck that connected this entire investigation back to a movie set built in 1989, closer than anyone involved could have possibly guessed. The first real crack in that 200-year silence came in 2003, and it's worth understanding exactly what happened then, because it explains both why the 2024 discovery felt so seismic and why it took another 2 decades to actually get there. In 2003, a team investigating the area on the left side of the Treasury's base found 2 tomb chambers cut into the rock. Inside, they found human remains, but fragmentary ones, partial, disturbed most likely by centuries of flooding, looting, and the simple erosion of time, working on a space that had been open in one way or another for 2 millennia. It was proof that people had been buried at the treasury. It confirmed the tomb theory wasn't baseless speculation. But fragments don't tell you much. You can't reconstruct a burial practice, a family structure, a diet, a cause of death from scattered bone fragments that have been sitting in disturbed sediment for 2,000 years. And then, for reasons that had more to do with funding than with a lack of scientific interest, the site went quiet. The dig was shut down, whatever else might have been down there, and researchers had long suspected there was more because Nabatean tomb architecture across the wider site tends to run in symmetrical pairs. Simply sat there, unexamined, for the better part of 20 years. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because it says something about how archaeology really works, as opposed to how it gets portrayed in documentaries that compress decades of institutional friction into a 90-second montage. This wasn't a case of nobody being curious enough to look. Researchers had a working hypothesis. They had a plausible location. What they didn't have was money, permission, and the right combination of both landing at the same moment, which turns out to be a much harder thing to assemble than the theory itself. Petra isn't an abandoned ruin nobody's watching. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of Jordan's most important sources of tourism revenue, drawing over 1 million visitors annually to walk through that same narrow gorge, stand in front of that same 40-meter facade, and take the same photograph everyone else takes. Any excavation directly beneath or around the treasury carries genuine risk. Structural risk to a monument that stood for 2,000 years. An economic risk to a country that depends heavily on this specific site remaining exactly as photogenic and stable as it's always been. Jordanian authorities weren't being obstructive for the sake of it. They were protecting something irreplaceable, and archaeological curiosity, however well-founded, doesn't automatically outweigh that responsibility. So the question the field kept circling back to, decade after decade, was whether there was a way to look without touching. And the answer to that question arrived not from archaeology at all, but from geophysics. The tools involved aren't exotic, even if they sound like it. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic pulses into the earth and measures how they bounce back, revealing differences in density and composition beneath the surface. Voids, walls, disturbed soil, all of it shows up as a distinct signature if you know how to read the returning signal. Electromagnetic conductivity surveys, sometimes called resistivity mapping, measure how easily electrical current passes through the ground, which changes noticeably where there's a cavity, a cut stone wall, or compacted fill instead of natural bedrock. Used together, these methods let researchers build something close to an X-ray of what's underground without moving a single grain of sand. In early 2024, a team led by geophysicist Richard Bates of the University of St. Andrews, working alongside Pierce Paul Kriesman of the American Center of Research and Jordan's Department of Antiquities, finally got the access they needed to run a proper survey. Not just of the previously excavated left side, but of the entire area surrounding the Treasury, including the right side, which had never been formally investigated at all. The team's working theory going in was straightforward and testable. If Nabatean tomb architecture really did favor symmetry, the way it appeared to elsewhere in Petra, then whatever sat beneath the left side of the Treasury in 2003 should have a mirror image sitting beneath the right. It was a hypothesis built on pattern, not certainty. And patterns in archaeology have a habit of breaking exactly when you're most confident in them. This time, the ground didn't break the pattern, it confirmed it. The radar readings from the right side of the Treasury showed something that made the research team's pulse quicken in a way that 30 years of field experience apparently doesn't fully immunize you against. A rectangular void, sharp-edged, structured in a way that natural geology simply doesn't produce on its own. Sandstone doesn't erode into perfect right angles. Water doesn't carve straight lines into bedrock over centuries the way a chisel does in a single afternoon. When a shape shows up on a radar scan with edges that clean, that consistent, that geometrically deliberate, you're not looking at a naturally occurring cavity, you're looking at something somebody made. And crucially, the readings from this new void closely mirrored the signatures the team had recorded on the left side back in 2003. Different location, same underlying structure. The symmetry hypothesis wasn't just holding up. It was practically confirming itself in real time, on a screen, before a single shovel had touched the ground. That data was enough to convince Jordanian authorities to approve something they'd been reluctant to allow for 2 decades. A formal excavation directly beneath one of the most photographed and economically vital monuments in the country. Permission this specific, this sensitive, doesn't get granted lightly, and it came with conditions. The dig would be methodical. It would be documented at every stage. And in a decision that turned out to matter far more than anyone on the research side initially expected, it would be filmed. Kriesman reached out to Josh Gates, the host of Discovery Channel's Expedition Unknown, a decision that on paper looks like it's about publicity and funding. And it partly was, because archaeology in the 21st century runs on grants, and grants respond to visibility. But it also meant that when the team broke ground in August of 2024, there was a professional film crew standing by to capture whatever came out of the sand in real time, without the delay and reconstruction that usually separates a discovery from the public's first look at it. What came out of that sand, layer by careful layer, was a rectangular chamber cut directly into the bedrock, sealed and, as far as anyone could tell, entirely undisturbed since it was closed nearly 2,000 years ago. Inside were 12 human skeletons. Here's the detail that mattered most to the archaeologists on site, more than the number itself, and it's a word that doesn't sound dramatic until you understand what it's actually telling you. Articulated. Every skeleton was found articulated, meaning each bone remained in its correct anatomical position relative to the others, exactly where it would have settled if the body had simply been laid to rest and left completely alone for 2 millennia. No looting, no flooding severe enough to scatter the remains, no later disturbance of any kind. In archaeology, articulated remains are genuinely rare, and rarer still at a site with Petra's long, complicated history of tomb robbery, seasonal flash floods, and 2 centuries of modern excavation activity happening in the surrounding area. Pierce Kriesman put it plainly in the aftermath. This represented the largest and most complete collection of intact human remains ever recovered from Petra. In the roughly 200 years archaeologists have been formally studying the site, the skeletons themselves told researchers they were looking at a genuine cross-section of people, not a single isolated burial. Men, women, children, arranged deliberately within the chamber, accompanied by grave goods, bronze implements, iron tools, ceramic vessels of varying sizes and apparent function, placed with the kind of intentionality that separates a careful burial from a hurried one. And then, as the team continued working through the chamber, someone reached one particular set of remains and stopped. In this skeleton's hand, resting exactly where it had been placed at the moment of burial, undisturbed by 20 centuries of sand and silence, sat a ceramic vessel. Broken at some point in its long history, missing its lower portion, but unmistakable in its upper shape. It looked like a chalice. You already know why that detail stopped everyone on site, but it's worth sitting with exactly how strange the coincidence actually is, because coincidence is doing a lot of quiet work in this story, and it deserves to be examined rather than just marveled at. In 1989, when Steven Spielberg's production team was scouting locations for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, they needed a building that could visually justify one of the most famous MacGuffins in film history. A temple hiding the Holy Grail, the cup Christ drank from at the Last Supper, guarded for centuries inside a mountain. They found the Treasury, filmed its facade for a handful of establishing shots, and built the rest of the interior on a soundstage. The production team had no archaeological reason for choosing this location. They chose it because it looked old enough, mysterious enough, and grand enough to be believable as the resting place of the most famous cup in Western mythology. It was set dressing, nothing more. 35 years later, an actual grail-shaped object turned up in an actual grave, in the actual ground, almost directly beneath the actual building the film crew had pointed their cameras at. Now, before this tips into something it isn't, because it would be easy and dishonest to let this story slide into implying some kind of mystical prophecy, it's worth being precise about what did and didn't happen here. The vessel found in that Nabatean tomb wasn't a grail in any meaningful religious sense. It wasn't connected to Christianity at all. The Nabatean kingdom predates and exists entirely outside the biblical narrative the film was built around. What archaeologists actually found was a broken ceramic jug, likely dating to sometime in the 1st century BC, of a shape and design that happened to closely resemble what most people picture when they hear the word chalice. Because that particular cup shape, narrow stem, wide bowl, has shown up independently across dozens of ancient cultures for entirely practical, non-mystical reasons. It holds liquid. It's easy to grip. It's a good design, and good designs get reinvented constantly across human history without anyone borrowing the idea from anyone else. So no, the Nabateans weren't secretly guarding the Holy Grail 2,000 years before a screenwriter imagined they might be. What actually happened is stranger in a quieter, more interesting way. A production designer in 1989, working entirely from instinct and visual logic, picked a location specifically because it radiated the kind of ancient mystery that could plausibly hold something sacred. And it turns out that instinct wasn't wrong. It just had the wrong sacred object in mind. The Treasury really was built to hold something the builders considered worth protecting for eternity. It just wasn't a cup Christ drank from. It was actual human beings. People the Nabateans loved enough, or respected enough, or feared enough in a religious sense to seal away with real ceremony and real permanence. Josh Gates, who was standing in the trench when the vessel came into view, described the moment plainly. Everyone on site simply froze. Not because they believed they'd found the actual grail. Nobody working that dig was confused about the difference between archaeology and screenwriting. They froze because of what the coincidence represented. A piece of fiction, invented to make a movie set feel appropriately ancient and mysterious, had accidentally landed almost exactly on top of something genuinely ancient and genuinely mysterious. Sometimes a good enough guess, made for entirely the wrong reasons, turns out to be standing closer to the truth than anyone involved could have known. There's something worth sitting with in that, something that goes beyond this one specific coincidence. We tend to draw a hard line between myth and evidence, between the stories we tell for entertainment and the facts researchers eventually dig up. Most of the time, that line holds. But every so often, a story invented purely for its emotional shape, mystery, sanctity, something ancient worth protecting, turns out to be pointing, however accidentally, at something real that hadn't been discovered yet. Not because the storytellers knew anything, because the instinct that shapes good fiction and the instinct that shapes real sacred architecture sometimes come from the same place in human psychology, a sense, culturally inherited across thousands of years, for what a resting place worth protecting actually looks like. The Nabateans understood that instinct as well as anyone in the ancient world. And the tomb they built to honor it is still, even now, only partially understood. Once the chalice moment passed and the initial astonishment settled, the actual scientific work began, and this is where the story shifts from a striking coincidence into something with real, lasting value for understanding who the Nabateans actually were, a question that has resisted easy answers for as long as archaeologists have been asking it. Start with something most people don't expect. The Nabateans left behind almost no written record of themselves. Not in the way you'd expect from a civilization wealthy and organized enough to carve an entire city into rock. No extensive royal chronicles, no detailed religious texts explaining their beliefs about death and the afterlife. Most of what scholars have pieced together about Nabatean life comes secondhand, filtered through Greek and Roman writers who observed this culture from the outside, often with the casual condescension ancient historians reserve for anyone they considered a trading partner rather than a peer civilization. That's a significant gap for a kingdom this influential, and it's part of why every physical discovery at Petra carries outsized weight. When you don't have their words, you have to read their bones. And the bones from this tomb had quite a lot to say once researchers actually got them into a laboratory setting. The team began with isotope analysis, a technique that sounds abstract until you understand what it actually reveals. The food and water a person consumes throughout their life leaves a chemical signature embedded in their bones and teeth, one that shifts depending on region, diet, and social status. Someone eating imported delicacies and drinking wine from distant vineyards leaves a very different isotopic fingerprint than someone subsisting on local grain and well water. Applied to the 12 skeletons found beneath the Treasury, this analysis promises to answer a question that's genuinely been open for 2 centuries. Were these people Nabatean royalty, elevated enough in status to warrant burial beneath the kingdom's most important monument? Or were they something else entirely? Priests, perhaps, or a family of unusual religious significance whose status came from function rather than bloodline? Early indications from the site complicate the simple answer in a way that researchers find more interesting than frustrating. Nabatean society, based on what limited evidence exists, appears to have been considerably less rigidly stratified than other ancient kingdoms of comparable wealth. Some historical accounts describe Nabatean kings dining alongside ordinary citizens, an arrangement that would have been almost unthinkable in contemporary Egypt or Rome, where the distance between ruler and ruled was engineered into every aspect of public life. If that's an accurate picture of how this society actually functioned, it raises a genuinely open question about the burial itself. In a culture that didn't rigidly separate its elite from its common people, the way most of the ancient world did, what actually determined who earned a resting place directly beneath the most sacred, most visible monument in the entire city? DNA testing, still in progress as of this recording, aims to answer a related and equally important question. Were these 12 people related to each other? A family unit buried together across 1 or more generations would suggest something about Nabatean kinship structures and inheritance practices that no Greek or Roman observer ever thought to record. Alternatively, if the genetic testing reveals these individuals came from entirely different lineages, it would suggest something else entirely. A burial chamber reserved not for blood relations, but for people connected by role, by achievement, or by a form of religious significance that operated independently of family ties altogether. There's also the material evidence sitting quietly beside the skeletons themselves, waiting on its own analysis. The bronze and iron implements found throughout the tomb are being examined for signs of function and origin. Were they crafted locally, using techniques passed down through Nabatean artisans, or imported through the same trade networks that made this kingdom wealthy in the first place? Carried along the same caravan routes that once moved frankincense and silk across the desert? The ceramic vessels, including the chalice-shaped one, that first stopped the excavation team in its tracks, are undergoing residue analysis, a process capable of detecting microscopic traces of whatever liquid or substance the vessels once held, even after 2,000 years of complete emptiness. None of these results were finalized at the time this story was first reported, which means the full picture of who these 12 people actually were is still, in the most literal sense, being written in a laboratory somewhere, one test at a time. But even without those final answers, the discovery had already accomplished something no amount of speculation over the previous 2 centuries had managed. It had turned the Treasury from a beautiful, unexplained facade into a monument with an actual, physical, evidence-based story finally beginning to take shape beneath it. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment and then get right back into it. If you've stayed with this video through the radar scans, the 20-year gap between 2003 and 2024, and a coincidence strange enough to connect a Hollywood soundstage to an actual archaeological dig, you're clearly someone who appreciates a story that earns its mystery honestly, rather than manufacturing one. That's exactly the kind of curiosity this channel exists for. And we put out videos like this every single day. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing costs you nothing, and it means you don't have to go looking for it. It just shows up. Now back to Petra, because there's a piece of this story that matters just as much as the tomb itself, and it's easy to miss if you only focus on what was found underground. It's the question of everything still standing above it, and what that says about how little of the city has actually been explored at all. Here's a number that tends to surprise people who assume Petra has been fully mapped, fully cataloged, fully understood after 2 centuries of study. Archaeologists estimate that as much as 85% of the city remains unexcavated. Not unexplored in some casual sense, genuinely physically unexcavated, still buried beneath centuries of sediment, sand, and flood debris, waiting for the same combination of funding, permission, and technological capability that finally unlocked the ground beneath the Treasury. Petra covers an enormous area, far larger than the narrow corridor most tourists actually walk through. Beyond the sick and the Treasury, the site extends across roughly 60 square kilometers of canyon, cliff, and desert terrain, dotted with tombs, temples, dwellings, and structures that have been identified from a distance but never formally open. Some of them are visible right now, carved facades sitting quietly in the rock, waiting for a research team with the resources to actually go inside. Others aren't visible at all, sitting entirely underground, the way the tomb beneath the Treasury sat for 2,000 years before anyone thought to point radar at that specific patch of ground. This is worth sitting with for a second because it reframes everything you just learned about the discovery beneath the Treasury. That wasn't an ending. It was closer to a proof of concept, solid evidence that the ground beneath Petra's most photographed monument still held something nobody had found in 2 centuries of looking, which means the same is almost certainly true across the rest of the site. If the most studied, most photographed square meter of Petra could hide something this significant for this long, the other 85% isn't a footnote. It's the actual scale of what's left to learn about an entire civilization. Richard Bates, the geophysicist who led the radar survey, said as much directly in the aftermath of the discovery. He described strong indications of additional voids in the surrounding area, more potential chambers, more potential tombs, sitting undisturbed and unexamined, waiting for the funding and permission necessary to look closer. It is highly likely, he said, that there are more to be found. Think about what that actually implies. Not a single lucky discovery, closed out neatly with a documentary special and a news cycle. An open door, a confirmed method, radar first, excavation second, patience and permission holding the whole process together, that can now, in theory, be pointed at dozens of other locations across 60 square kilometers of largely unexamined ancient city. And there's a specific practical reason this particular door might stay open for longer than most archaeological discoveries typically do. Discovery Channel's involvement, whatever your feelings about reality television intersecting with serious archaeology, brought something this field has always struggled to secure consistently: public attention, and with it, funding interest. Grants for slow, expensive, uncertain excavation work are notoriously difficult to secure through traditional academic channels alone. A viral discovery, especially one with a genuinely compelling story attached to it, a movie prop turning out to sit near something real, tends to loosen purse strings that pure academic proposals rarely manage to loosen on their own. Which means the 12 skeletons, the chalice-shaped vessel, and the strange 35-year coincidence connecting a soundstage to a sealed tomb may end up being remembered not just for what they revealed, but for what they made possible next. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment and then get right back into it. If you've stayed with this video through the radar scans, the 20-year gap between 2003 and 2024, and a coincidence strange enough to connect a Hollywood soundstage to an actual archaeological dig, you're clearly someone who appreciates a story that earns its mystery honestly, rather than manufacturing one. That's exactly the kind of curiosity this channel exists for. And we put out videos like this every single day. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing costs you nothing, and it means you don't have to go looking for it. It just shows up. Now back to Petra, because there's a piece of this story that matters just as much as the tomb itself, and it's easy to miss if you only focus on what was found underground. It's the question of everything still standing above it, and what that says about how little of the city has actually been explored at all. Here's a number that tends to surprise people who assume Petra has been fully mapped, fully cataloged, fully understood after 2 centuries of study. Archaeologists estimate that as much as 85% of the city remains unexcavated. Not unexplored in some casual sense, genuinely physically unexcavated, still buried beneath centuries of sediment, sand, and flood debris, waiting for the same combination of funding, permission, and technological capability that finally unlocked the ground beneath the Treasury. Petra covers an enormous area, far larger than the narrow corridor most tourists actually walk through. Beyond the sick and the Treasury, the site extends across roughly 60 square kilometers of canyon, cliff, and desert terrain, dotted with tombs, temples, dwellings, and structures that have been identified from a distance but never formally open. Some of them are visible right now, carved facades sitting quietly in the rock, waiting for a research team with the resources to actually go inside. Others aren't visible at all, sitting entirely underground, the way the tomb beneath the Treasury sat for 2,000 years before anyone thought to point radar at that specific patch of ground. This is worth sitting with for a second because it reframes everything you just learned about the discovery beneath the Treasury. That wasn't an ending. It was closer to a proof of concept. Solid evidence that the ground beneath Petra's most photographed monument still held something nobody had found in 2 centuries of looking, which means the same is almost certainly true across the rest of the site. If the most studied, most photographed square meter of Petra could hide something this significant for this long, the other 85% isn't a footnote. It's the actual scale of what's left to learn about an entire civilization. Richard Bates, the geophysicist who led the radar survey, said as much directly in the aftermath of the discovery. He described strong indications of additional voids in the surrounding area, more potential chambers, more potential tombs, sitting undisturbed and unexamined, waiting for the funding and permission necessary to look closer. It is highly likely, he said, that there are more to be found. Think about what that actually implies. Not a single lucky discovery, closed out neatly with a documentary special and a news cycle. An open door, a confirmed method, radar first, excavation second, patience and permission holding the whole process together, that can now, in theory, be pointed at dozens of other locations across 60 square kilometers of largely unexamined ancient city. And there's a specific practical reason this particular door might stay open for longer than most archaeological discoveries typically do. Discovery Channel's involvement, whatever your feelings about reality television intersecting with serious archaeology, brought something this field has always struggled to secure consistently: public attention, and with it, funding interest. Grants for slow, expensive, uncertain excavation work are notoriously difficult to secure through traditional academic channels alone. A viral discovery, especially one with a genuinely compelling story attached to it, a movie prop turning out to sit near something real, tends to loosen purse strings that pure academic proposals rarely manage to loosen on their own. Which means the 12 skeletons, the chalice-shaped vessel, and the strange 35-year coincidence connecting a soundstage to a sealed tomb may end up being remembered not just for what they revealed, but for what they made possible next.